بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد حبيب رب العالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Welcome to our weekly Q&A session in which we try to answer some of the common questions that people have. So we're going to open with the first question for tonight.
So the first question is, I'm a student living in Belgium and studying cooking culinary school, the French cuisine to be specific. How do I handle the food and products? Is there a fiqh related to working in a kitchen as a job? Presumably that there may be not halal food in the cuisine.
Is there a fiqh related to handling food? So, yes. And there's fiqh related to the halal and haram of food, and one should be aware of, one is obligated to be aware of the limits related to any area of human activity that one is engaged in, right? So anything that one is going to engage in, it's a good that the questioner asked this question. The basic governing principle is that any area of human activity that one is going to engage in, it is necessary to know before engaging in it what is the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala regarding that area of human activity and what are the limits of the specific issues that arise in it. So given that, one needs to be careful with respect to halal and haram food ingredients, particularly meat, because haram meat is haram to consume. Right? Haram meat is haram to consume, and anything that is haram to consume is also haram to present to another, because the principle is that anything that you cannot consume yourself, you cannot give to another. Anything that you cannot consume yourself, you cannot give to another. So therefore, cooking haram meat would be problematic. Right? It would be problematic. And one also has to be careful about the handling of such ingredients, because meat that is haram is also, which is meat that's not been ritually slaughtered, is also considered filthy. It's considered filthy. So it puts several constraints upon one, right? And then the issue comes of halal and haram ingredients. The wisdom behind the prohibition of meat unless it's ritually slaughtered is that eating meat requires killing an animal, and the taking of a human life is a grave matter, but so is the taking of any life. Right? It's a serious matter. So there are limits placed as to how one can take even an animal life for the purpose of consumption, so that we appreciate the inviolability of not just human life, but also animal life, and we recognize the blessing that it is for us to have the permission to eat that animal. So there are limits placed. So how does one navigate that as a Muslim who wants to, for example, become a chef? That there are perhaps challenging limits with respect to that. Particularly because working in a mainstream kitchen where presumably meat will be one of the things that is served would be very challenging for a Muslim. Right? It would be very challenging for a Muslim because one cannot cook or prepare the haram. Right? In particular cases and circumstances, one needs to consult reliable scholars on how to navigate that بإذن ta'ala. But those are some of the criteria. One should take the means to learn about the halal and haram related to meat and other food ingredients as well, in a broad sense. But the biggest challenge with food arises with meat. Go ahead.
So the second question is, can you give Muslim sisters in non-Muslim countries some guidelines when it comes to hijab? Wearing our black abaya can be very catchy, which defeats the purpose of hijab. And many of us are having to restrict our activities so we don't put ourselves in physical danger, especially these days with what's happening politically and Islamophobia. So what are some guidelines regarding that?
So the question about hijab and dress guidelines, there is no specific religious obligation to wear a black abaya, right? The command for both men and women is that one cover what is considered one's awra, right? Which is to cover what must be covered for a man, for a woman, and that one do so in a manner that is modest and dignified. So, and anything that fulfills, covering what must be covered in a modest and dignified manner, fulfills the divine command. Right? There's not one mode of dress, and there's not one particular type or style of clothing that is required in order to do so. So it does not have. There's no particular color. Right? There's no inherent merit in wearing black or wearing a single color, etc. However, and we have a number of answers related to this. What must be covered, which for a man is from navel to knee, and for a woman, meaning in front of strangers, is everything besides the face, hands, and in the Hanafi school, the feet. For a woman, that anything that covers that and does so in a modest and dignified way would be basically sufficient. So that gives a lot of leeway in how that command is fulfilled. And if one looks for example and inspiration across the Muslim world, the different types of dress that traditionally was considered modest and dignified that fulfilled that was very variegated. And even in terms of colors, I was reading some North African scholars are actually quite critical of, there's no religious expectation nor merit in a Muslim woman in Tunisia, for example, or Libya, dressing like a woman in Saudi. There's nothing in the modes by which the command is fulfilled are many. They say also practically that if you think you're a doormat, people will walk all over you, right? That one religiously needs to be steadfast on what one knows to be the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One fulfills that command in a sensitive manner, in a manner that takes into place the society and related considerations. But when it comes to the divine command, one should be aware, okay, these are the limits and these are the underlying values that one is striving to uphold, and one upholds them, and one should have the confidence to be able to do so, right? And part of what gives one the strength to be able to do so is that the Prophet ﷺ said, "Alaykum bil jama'ah," be in community. Wa iyyakum wal furqa, and beware of being alone. For the shaitan is close to the one alone, is more distant from two. Whoever seeks the vast expanses of paradise, let them be with the community. Right? If one remains, one tries to practice one's religion, and particularly things that one may find challenging, just out there in the weeds on one's own, it's easy to feel very overwhelmed by it. But if one practices one's religion in the context of community of others with common concern, with common commitment, who also believe in upholding that guidance and those values, then that gives one the strength and commitment to do so. As a believer, we should also be aware of the society that we're in and the rights that it accords us. Right? And one, as an individual in the community, one should stand up for those rights, not just for oneself, but also actively stand up for the rights of others to practice to have the freedom of religion and freedom of religious practice, etc. So that's something we have to be very careful that be guarded. And the other aspect that the ulama mentioned regarding dress and conduct is that modesty in dress does not entail sternness in conduct. Right? That they say that if you have good character, you can get away with pretty much anything. Right? That if you're a nice person, people really ultimately wouldn't care how you behave. Right? I have a friend who was a very successful IT professional. He used to go to work in shalwar kameez and a big messy turban. I asked him, how do you pull that off? He said, I'm just good at what I do and I try to be a nice guy about it. As if you're really good at what you do and you're really nice to those around you, do whatever you want. And those are two things in terms of our conduct, that whatever we do, we should, the believer strives to be a person of excellence, right? In one's work, etc. One's a person of excellence. And number two, to uphold good character, right? To be friendly and cheerful and helpful and caring and so on. To uphold these sunnahs of social conduct and to place one's trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not to worry. The solution isn't just to say, well, it's difficult, so I won't do it. Because then religion is not possible to. And then one's chipping away at one's own religion and its sustainability. Just grab the mic.
Yes. Next question is there a good recommended explanation or sharh on the Baiquniya in English?
I don't know. Next.
In the Hanafi madhhab, there is a khilaf regarding eating prawns. May one legitimately follow the opinion of permissibility in the Hanafi madhhab or not?
So what's the ruling of consuming prawn in the Hanafi school, right? The underlying issue is that in the Hanafi school, only fish is allowed from the produce of the sea. What is considered fish is what the Arabs considered fish at the time of revelation. Because revelation came permitting the produce of the sea. And the produce of the sea, the Arabs considered that if it's fish, you can eat it. If it's other stuff, you can't. Right? And then the various schools differed on what are the guidelines governing that. The Hanafis were more, each school has its particular restrictions regarding what was considered fine and what was not considered fine of the produce of the sea. In the Hanafi school, the criterion is fish is permitted, what is not fish is not permitted. There is a difference in judgment. Did Arabs at the time of revelation consider shrimp or prawn, which is to be found in the seas around the Arabian Peninsula, did they consider that to be what they call samak from fish? Some said yes, others said no. So on the basis of that, there is well-established difference of opinion regarding that. Right? So there is leeway in it. Right? if someone, and we have a number of answers on Seekers Hub that explain that. So many of the scholars, and a lot of scholars from the Indian subcontinent, have held that yes, it is permitted in the Hanafi school to eat shrimp or prawn, and there's others who didn't. One thing you can't do, you cannot try to be cautious and take things easy. The two things are contradictory, and sometimes people contort themselves, like, you know, sort of they go into pretzel, they try to become human pretzels, that, okay, I want to be cautious, but I want to eat whatever I can. Now, how are you going to pull that one off? Because if you want to be cautious, then you need to apply the principles of caution related to your conduct. And if you don't, then you should know clearly what the limits are and don't go past those limits. Right? Caution is religiously praiseworthy. Right? But the way you practice caution, if someone wants to be cautious, caution is not simply to make things difficult for oneself. Right? One of the great Hanafi scholars came up with a beautiful principle, right? That the basis of caution is not strictness. The basis of Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam, that the basis of caution is to be careful to do that which is more likely to be more pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, what is the scale by which we know what is more likely to be pleasing to Allah? That scale and standard is knowledge. Is knowledge. It's not simply that, okay, I don't know if it is halal, so I'm not going to do it. No, if you want to be cautious, or something is halal. So let's say bread, the basis of bread is its permissibility. So I don't know if this bread is halal, so I'm going to just avoid bread. There's people who said, I've seen places where they have certified halal water. I kid you not. I'm not going to mention the country. And it would take a lot to have something that's considered water and it not to be halal. Right? It's almost inconceivable. So, and Sidi Amjad has been to that country where we have certified halal water. We travel there together. Right? So if one wants to be cautious, the key is learn. Right? Learn. Like what are the principles of caution related to this particular endeavor? So in the Hanafi school, if someone wishes to take that opinion, it's a sound, well-established opinion in the madhhab, in the Hanafi school, one can eat prawn. Wants to be cautious and wants to avoid it, that is their prerogative. Right? That if someone wishes to be cautious in it, but the ruling of caution, that where caution is called for, it is recommended. It is not incumbent. There's also a broader reality. So if someone is taking that opinion, you cannot think ill of anybody who is doing anything that is permissible within the Sharia, on any sound opinion within mainstream Islam. You may not do it, but the act of thinking ill of another who is doing something in itself permissible within the Sharia is that it's sinful. Right? And sometimes that's one of the areas that religious people commit sin. That they're trying to be cautious, so they look down on someone who isn't. But it's not obligatory to be cautious. And there is an opinion permitting it. As in Sham, in the Syrian scholars, they say, Mish ala kifik. It's not the way you want it to be. Right? So that's something to be aware of in these matters. It is also true that while it is praiseworthy for someone to strive to adhere to one school of Islamic law, right, and the scholars encourage that because it gives a standard of taqwa in one's practice, in itself, the majoritarian opinion within Islamic scholarship is that you are religiously bound to follow a sound religious opinion on every single action that you do. Right? You don't have to follow the same school's opinion on everything that you do. So if someone, quote unquote, is Hanafi, but they're eating oyster, for example, or they're eating squid or some other seafood, you cannot think ill of them. Why? Because those seafoods, there are schools within Islamic scholarship that permit it, and maybe they're taking a dispensation, and you can, thinking ill of them would be impermissible there. It's in itself superior to stick to your own school, but someone may be doing it for a reason. Okay? So once, I generally, I don't eat these kinds of things, but once someone had invited me out, and I was in conversation, and they were going, there's this amazing ingredient, there's this amazing dish they have here, etc. I'm going to order it to you. They're so excited, and it was this calamari dish, and they're really excited. And they're like, Shaykh Faraz, try some. Now, normally, as a Hanafi, I wouldn't eat calamari. But now, in front of everybody, I'm not going to tell them, oh, I don't eat that, because it'll embarrass them. Right? So one of the situations where the ulama state that one can take a sound dispensation is for the sake of another. So you grew up, let's say, in New England, and there, let's say, you have an aunt there, and she made you some lobster dish. So you're visiting, she spent all day making this fancy lobster dish, and you say, oh, I don't eat lobster anymore. Right? It's within your right to do that, but that may be a situation where you may take a dispensation for the sake of another. Right? And what considerations are governing someone's choices, that's not up to you. So that's something just to keep in mind as well with respect to the actions of those around us. The final thing when it comes to caution with respect to food that requires is that if someone wants to be cautious regarding food, there's 3 basic things just to keep in mind. One is that be careful regarding restaurants. Right? Be careful regarding restaurants, particularly restaurants where there isn't a standard of caution with respect to what they are offering you. Because sometimes our attitude with respect to the halal restaurant industry defies common sense. Right? So if there's some restaurant that says we're halal, but they've got posters of film stars, and they're blasting haram music, and they're selling haram DVDs, and they're doing all these haram things. Oh, but the meat is halal. And that's a point of obvious caution, right? That be sensibly careful with respect to where you get your food from. Right? There's a basic common sense caution, and particularly when it comes to meat. And that's why, as a community, it's a good practice that we have halal certification agencies that look at so that there's a verifiable standard for this, because the opportunity for abuse is clear. So be careful about halal restaurants, and not to doubt them. We don't have to judge is it allowed or not, but to be careful, right? And it's from basic caution to only, if you're going to go eat at an establishment, to choose establishments where there's some good reason to believe that they are being careful, right? And to be discerning, particularly if you go somewhere often. You do go, let's say your family, have a large family here in Toronto now, many families, they'll, when they have family gathering, they'll order food from a particular restaurant. The places that you do go to, you go to a burger place every once in a while, whatever, make at least those kinds of places, verify that it's somewhere that is, you have good reason to believe it's halal, without making judgment that other places are haram or whatever. That's number one with respect to so there's baseline caution about, be careful about where you eat from. The second thing to be careful about with respect to food ingredients is that something that has 4 ingredients is much easier to verify than something that has 44 ingredients. Okay? And both in terms of religious permissibility, but also health-wise. Beware of processed foods. Okay? Health-wise, they're probably not good for you, but religiously, something has 44 ingredients, right? You're making life complicated for yourself. When we're in Damascus, and this is really a scholar speaking from his fitrah. Someone asked Sheikh Muhammad Jumu'ah, respected Hanafi scholar, that these imported French cheeses, what's the ruling of them? And he looked incredulous. He said, "Ish biddak fiha." He said, what do you want with those cheeses? He says, خُذْ لَكْ قَاعِدَةً. He said, take a principle. He said, كُلُّ طَعَامٍ مَسَتْهُ الْمَصَانِعَ فَهُوَ مَشْبُوهٌ. And that's an amazing principle. Any food that has been touched by a factory should be considered dubious. Because food does not need to go through a factory to be consumed. He said, if you want cheese, go to the local milk store. And they have these places, the Mahal Alban, right, where the milk is locally sourced. You know the milk shop owner, etc. You know the milk from a wholesome place. The guy is from your neighborhood. He prepares the cheese, right? So, so be wary of that, right? Because not just in terms dubiousness, but also, health-wise. The other aspect with respect to food, especially the things that one consumes regularly, and this applies to other areas of one's consumption, is that part of something being tayyib is where you get it from should be tayyib. And we're negligent regarding this. And it's very clear in the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ that the hands of people and the motives of people affect the spiritual wholesomeness of what they produce. And that injustice and ill motive in the preparation or production of goods and services affects them. We know this from clothing. The Prophet ﷺ, when he would wear a new garment, he would make dua. Right? That, oh Allah, this is a thobe. And he'd name the particular item. Allahumma yasaluka khayrahu wa khayra ahlihi wa khayra ma suni'a min ajlihi. That, oh Allah, ask you for the good of this, and the good of those who made it, and the good of what it was made for. And, oh Allah, I seek refuge from the harm of it, meaning actual or potential, and the harm of its people, and the harm of what they made it for. Right? And the ulama have explained this in detail. But when it comes to your clothing, your food, etc., part of religious caution is to be aware of where is this sourced from. Is there injustice and oppression, harm associated with it? And the believer neither harms nor accepts harm. That's one of the foundational principles of our religion. We neither harm nor accept harm. So that is, at a collective level, it's obligatory to ward off indirect harm. At a personal level, it's recommended. So be careful regarding that. So where you get your food from, etc., and one should be a discerning customer when it comes to these things, right? And there's no less harm, and especially a lot of these multinationals, etc., the harm they do. We can talk about terrorism, and I could make this. Coca-Cola kills many more people than terrorism does. Right? And one just needs to be aware of that reality, that we have to be aware of the harmful effect of these corporations. Nestle has destroyed entire economies successfully. Right? So one has to be careful, or just to not, picking on two of many criminal organizations. So one needs to be careful about that as well. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us of those who are discerning with respect to the choices we make. And just as food, it's very clear in the sunnah that being careful of what you wear is critical. Right? That's why the Prophet ﷺ made so many du'as for it. And to be honest, when in an hour's time this place is more full, if everyone took off every item of clothing that is not sourced ethically, most people here will be naked. Most of what you're wearing, unless you have made deliberate, conscious choices to dress ethically, most of it is sourced through ways that there's oppression. That ridiculously cheap undergarments were made because people are People are being crushed for your socks, your undergarments, your shirt, your trousers, for most of it. So be discerning regarding that. Be aware, particularly the things that you get regularly. Choose wholesome food. Choose wholesome clothing, right? And if you do, you'll find divine assistance and facilitation, because good is not sought through harm, right? نسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى التيسير والعافية. We'll take one more question.
So, is it permissible to play Ludo, which is, according to the dictionary, a simple game, board game, in which players move counters round a board according to throws of a dice?
So, is it permissible to play board games where dice are involved, right? So there are two positions amongst the ulama with respect to board games where dice are involved, right? Some ulama have considered any games which dice are involved to be from games of chance which are not permitted. That's a precautionary opinion. Others distinguish that games that are based on on skill and there's no element of gambling involved in them, right? So, for example, you have things like Trivial Pursuit and so on. There's an element of skill, etc. There's no meaning of gambling in them, right? Then they would permit those kinds of games where there's an element of skill, but there's an element of chance as well. That there's a roll of dice. Can you play Dungeons and Dragons, for example? Right? There's all kinds of dice involved, right? But it's a game of skill. Unless you get really into it, there's no money involved. Right? If you bring money into it, that becomes a complicating factor. So, where there's games of skill, or there's games where they're entertaining and they're done with restraint. There are those who would, there are many contemporary ulama who would consider those to be permitted. So that dice are not inherently impermissible, but they're impermissible when there's a meaning of gambling in them, right? And particularly the clearest ones are games in which there is otherwise skill involved, right? There's otherwise skill involved and no meaning of gambling. So we have a number of answers related to that. You can check those out at the Seekers Hub website. One last question before any questions from here?
If one is taking 5 classes each week, how can one best balance the repetition and moving forward with these classes, and how can one best structure their time?
One's taking 5 classes each week. How can one best balance? The basic ethos regarding anything that one's trying to do is do less, better. That applies to studies, applies to activism, this applies to life goals. Do fewer things and do them better, right? The Prophet ﷺ said, Allah loves that if any of you does anything, they do it with excellence. And very often, where people will dabble in 10 things. So you're involved in politics and social justice and activism and this and that. Pick a few, do the amount of things that you can do with excellence. And the same thing applies to religious studies. It's better to study one subject and do it well so that you'll be able to retain it. So that way you can benefit yourself and others from it. If you do 2, the same criteria. Do the amount that you can prepare for, be attentive for, and review so that you can retain it. And they say studying something well should be such that once you've completed it, you could explain all the key concepts to another person without having to open the book, right? Just okay, lesson 3 we covered this, and you could explain all of it without having to look it up, right? Because you've reviewed, etc. The key to be able to do that is leave that which does not concern you, right? the Prophet ﷺ said, from the excellence of a person's Islam is to leave that which does not concern one. Right? And if you busy yourself with the things that don't concern you, then the things that do concern you, you won't be able to get done. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that, and you have 168 hours in the week. A lot of them are being wasted. Right? I don't have time. You do, you just spend it foolishly. So you need, if you get rid of at least the dispensable folly, and there's foolish things that you're really committed to. So your life revolves around Real Madrid. May Allah help you. Okay? But that's more difficult to leave. But there's some things that we engage in that are either sinful or, like you're not that interested in any. You're just going through the motions. Get rid of the things that are easier to get rid of. You're just doing it. You just develop a habit. You watch the morning and night news. So you say, okay, I'll cut down on one of them. Because not much changes from morning to night. Right? So you cut out the things that are easier to cut out. And you'll find that you have a shocking amount of time in your life. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala facilitate and grant us understanding of our religion and facilitate for us the pursuit of that which will be of benefit for us and for others in this life and the next, directly and indirectly. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala bin nas al-khair wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam taslima walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Jazakumullah khair for all the questions, and for those online, the questions that weren't asked this week, inshallah, will be asked next week. This is on Fridays at 7 p.m. EST and 12 a.m. GMT. Jazakumullah khair.